Good morning. I'm Bonnie Gardner. I'm co-chair of the Public Affairs Forum of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Austin, 4700 Grover Avenue. Our forums are free and open to the public. We encourage you to attend Sundays at noon. If you want more information about our forums, please go to our website at www.austinuu.org. And now I want to introduce one of our church members, Judy Sadak, who's going to introduce our panelists today who are speaking on immigration. Judy? Okay, just use the microphone there.
Thank you. I am a member of the Forum Committee as well as the Social Action Committee and Action for Justice Committee. You might notice there's a lot of action there, and I'm very excited about our panel today because these are people who are all doing action in our community on behalf of immigrants and immigrant rights. If you came expecting Esther Reyes of the Austin Immigrant Rights Coalition, I'm sorry she was not able to make it, but we do have her notes that she would have presented. And I know that our panel is going to do a great job. And as I said, they're all church members, and they've all been very active. I'm going to introduce each one of them briefly, and then if they want to provide more information about their interests and roles, they can do that. We will save questions until the end, as usual, and they've assured me that they're going to allow plenty of time for discussion. Peggy Morton is our Social Action Committee Chair. And since returning from the Justice General Assembly in Phoenix last June, she has spearheaded efforts to support immigrants in our community and beyond. Next, we have Samantha Fredrickson, who's an attorney and an executive director of a small nonprofit in the community. And she's chair of our Action for Justice Committee, which she'll be talking about more. She also has past experience with the New York Civil Liberties Union, where her work focused on immigrant rights. Karen Neeley is an attorney. She's a longtime member of this congregation and is a registered Texas lobbyist. Karen has been very essential in our newly created Action for Justice Committee because of her great experience and knowledge in working with the legislature. And lastly, we have Vick Cornell. He's the statewide advocacy manager for the ACLU of Texas and campaign coordinator for their Religious Freedom campaign. He's been at the ACLU since 2005. So I give you our panel.
Hello, I'm sharing background on how our First UU Social Action Group's involvement started in working toward immigration reform. Personally, I'm a retired teacher who not only taught English as a second language in the public schools, but continued voluntarily teaching ESL to adults after retiring. And frankly, immigrants have grabbed my heart. I find them hardworking, creative, and intelligent, and eager learners. Last May, Reverend Meg named me the chair of our Social Action Committee here. She, at the same time, also named Wendy Arisman as head of the congregation-wide committee that would eventually be planning a month-long series of activities regarding one social justice issue. Then I read about GA, which Judy mentioned. GA is the General Assembly of UUs from across the nation getting together. And unlike other people who were boycotting their conventions that had been set in Arizona, we were asked to please bring all the UUs we could to Arizona because the theme was social justice. Well, of course, that meant I needed to attend my first GA. There, I became more acquainted with Judy Sadak, who you just heard from, and it's really good to team up with an experienced person because there's so much going on in this type of a convention. And I got to attend lots of sessions where I learned about immigrants, their situation. I also found out about the National Day Labor Organizing Network, who was organizing the undocubus riders who would be traveling across the country under the theme, No Papers, No Fear. Judy also introduced me to a San Antonio First UU member, Mike Phillips, who had been working for about 5 years at the time towards starting up a Texas-wide group to become politically active and to get UUs organized. I returned from GA and called my first social action committee meeting under my leadership, where a Wildflower UU member brought this paper and introduced us to the Austin Immigrant Rights Coalition. They were a group that was working on human rights for Austin. They're working on a document to advocate for human rights for Austin. I was quite moved by their work because they strongly believed that the next big movement in our country would be about human rights. I started attending several of their meetings, and one of the first things they did is they organized a rally, or one of the first things I learned about was a rally that they were planning for people to go and stand in front of Sheriff Greg Hamilton's office because they wanted to protest what was going on that makes Travis County have one of the highest deportation rates in our country for non-criminal undocumented workers. Well, Judy and I again got together and we organized church members to go to the rally. At that rally, there were about 25 UUs there, not only from First UU Austin, but also from Live Oak UU and Wildflower UU. And we started hearing some stories. Now, I should say, while we were there, many of us were wearing our, becoming quite well known across the country, our Standing on the Side of Love t-shirts. We, as a nation, have, UUs across the nation are wearing this same emblem, the same bright yellow color, because we are standing on the side of love. And it's not just a slogan, it's something that gives us more depth as we get out there, and particularly in the case of immigration. People know us far and wide. I should say back at the GA convention, 3,000 of us gathered in front of Sheriff Judge Arpaio's Tent City Jail. But anyway, so back to where we are. We have our first rally. One of the speakers at that rally was a young college dreamer who had actually spent 4 nights in jail for having jaywalked. I've jaywalked many times and never been picked up. If I was stopped for it, I would get a small fine, but not if you're in that kind of situation. Well, personally, we heard lots of stories, and what I think most of our UUs really related to is we didn't like families being torn apart. We do adhere to our principle, knowing that all people deserve to be treated with worth and dignity, and we didn't see that happening regarding immigrants. I was also, at that time, in the middle of organizing our church to house and feed those undocubus riders who were going to be in Austin for 3 nights and 4 days. I had a great network of people from the church because I am also a coordinator of our freeze night shelter that we offer for the homeless. And as typical, our congregation came out, brought them food, did lots of, treated them very well, hosted them wonderfully. Now, Indalon, that day labor group who was organizing them, also invited Bob Leibel, who is the executive director of the Grassroots Leadership, and he came to train us and train people that wanted to learn about what's going on with with detention centers. And he trained us on what we needed to do to visit those detention centers, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that later. So, next thing that's going on is Wendy is calling her first meeting. That congregation-wide group that I mentioned earlier, it's now called Spring Into Action. And basically, several of us who had attended GA kind of pounced on the meeting, and we really advocated because it was Wendy's duty to get to know everyone in the congregation and see what issue we would all get together on. And a majority of us were very excited about immigration, and that's what our church jumped into. I hope some of you have been able to attend the activities we've had going throughout the month of April, which will culminate next weekend on Sunday, May 5th, when we will have lots of volunteer opportunities and the congregation can learn other things. What are our next steps that we want our congregation to do? So another thing happened on the way to today, and that was my joining with Mike Phillips, the organizer of the Texas UU Justice Ministry. he had asked me if the steering committee could have a meeting, so some UU leaders from around the state who were already interested in becoming politically active could get together and have a meeting. Well, at the same time, I was also attending a book study group, and I had met longtime church member Karen Neeley. It was very obvious from her comments in that meeting. Well, for one thing, I learned she was a lobbyist. It was obvious she was quite intelligent. It was also obvious she was outrageously busy. But I still asked if by chance she might like to come to a meeting with a group who's trying to organize UUs across Texas. And she looked at me, her eyes lit up, and she said, "My husband has always wondered why First UU Austin doesn't organize politically when we're so close to the Capitol." Okay, so anyway, we had the meeting. That was our involvement with the Texas UU Justice Ministry. From there, I realized we needed to have a shorter group, or we needed to move more quickly than the big Texas group could. So I called a social action meeting, and that's where we got Samantha Fredrickson, who stepped forward to chair our social action committee. And with that, many of us have gone to rallies, vigils, press conferences organized by Austin Immigrant Rights Coalition and the the Border Network for Human Rights. But anyway, now let's hear more from Samantha. Thank you.
Thank you, Peggy. So as Peggy mentioned, the UUA and now this church has a tradition of defending and protecting immigrants' rights. So what I wanted to talk about today, and I'm going to try to do this in a very short amount of time, is give you a little bit of a little bit briefer, we'll say, about the 800-page immigration bill that was released earlier this month. But before I talk about that, I wanted to just say a little something about what the UUA principles are on comprehensive immigration reform, because I think that can help us put it in context of what the bill is doing. So the UUA, which has been advocating for comprehensive immigration reform for some time now, along with other faith groups and civic leaders, argues for a few specific things in reform. One of those is family unification, and that means stopping the deportations. That means keeping families together, allowing non-traditional families and same-sex couples to sponsor their partner from another country. A path to citizenship is another part of what the UUA hopes to see, and that is ideally an affordable, accessible, and non-punitive path to citizenship that's not dependent upon border enforcement. The UUA has also advocated for the protection of workers, arguing that the rights should be fully protected as an employee, that they should be able to travel back and forth from the US to their home country as needed, and the UUA opposes any sort of electronic verification systems that employers put into place to track employees. Another principle that the UUA has advocated for is facilitating the integration of immigrants to this country, and that means providing social services to immigrants who are here in the U.S., having the U.S. government provide some financial, some money to states to have English classes and civics classes, making the process of becoming a citizen a little bit easier. Restoring due process is another principle that the UUA has argued, and that's stopping the raids, improving conditions in detention centers, improving access to courts. And lastly, the UUA has argued that any immigration reform should align immigration laws with humanitarian values. And that's really getting at border policies, making sure that border protection does not damage the land, does not damage the environment, does not damage sacred sites of indigenous peoples, and that any sort of border patrol is not affecting the rights of either people crossing the border or people who are living in the border communities. So these are some of the principles that the UUA has said should be in comprehensive immigration reform. So now, does the bill that was introduced earlier this month reflect all of these? Not quite, but there are some positive things in the bill. And I think it's important to note also that, comprehensive immigration reform is something that people have been advocating for years and years and years. There's been, many people have argued that the immigration system has been broken. So the fact that we have a bill that's introduced by a bipartisan group of senators and has a very good chance of passing really is a historic moment. So we should be thankful that we are at this point. I mean, I started working on comprehensive immigration reform in 2009 at my previous job when I was living in New York, and there was kind of no hope then. So it's exciting to see that this is really going to happen. So what does the bill do? Now, as I mentioned, this is an 800-page bill, so I'm not an expert by any means, and I have not read the entire bill, but I'm going to do my best to just give you, in a few minutes, a brief summary of some of the highlights, both positive and negative, because there are positive things in this bill, but there are negative things as well. So the first section of the bill addresses border security, which has some positives and negatives. The bill allocates approximately $6.5 billion to increasing border security, which is a tremendous amount of money. And what it would do is the bill will authorize the Department of Homeland Security to put in specific procedures that would essentially militarize the border. So it would include 24-hour surveillance, both by people, by aircraft, by drone, by patrol on horseback. It's going to include a lot more fencing. The bill gives the National Guard actually much more power to enforce along the border and to work with Customs and Border Patrol agents. Another thing that's problematic about the Border Patrol section of the bill is that it has to be operational before the Path to Citizenship section of the bill can go into effect. So what that means is that we're not going to see anyone being able to go down this path to citizenship, which I'll talk about next, until the Department of Homeland Security has implemented these measures at the border and until there's a 90% effectiveness rate at the border. So this will take at least a year, maybe a little more. And this is problematic because it's enforcement first and then addressing the needs of the people. So we need to advocate to try to change that. The positive things about this section of the bill, it increases oversight by the creation of an immigration ombudsman who will take complaints about treatment of the Border Patrol and enforcement of policies and such. It also would create a Department of Homeland Security task force that would be comprised of faith leaders, civic leaders, residents of border communities, and of course Customs and Border Patrol agents as well. And this task force would look at the implementation of these policies. So that's border security in a nutshell. Path to citizenship. This is something that the UUA, as I mentioned, and many other civic and faith leaders have advocated for. We have 11 million estimated undocumented immigrants in the country, and so any immigration legislation needs to address the people who are currently living here, and this bill does do that. Basically what it says is that anyone who entered the U.S. before December 31st, 2011 will be able to apply for something called Registered Provisional Immigrant Status, so RPI. And remember, they can't apply for this RPI status, though, until the Border Patrol section goes into effect. So it'll be at least a year from when the bill passes that people will be able to apply for this RPI status. They'll have to pay a $500 fine. And if they have been convicted of either 3 misdemeanors or a felony, they cannot apply for RPI status. So let's assume and if you also have to be above 100% of the poverty level. So if you meet all of these requirements, you can apply for RPI status. You'll be a registered provisional immigrant for 10 years. After 10 years, you can apply to become a lawful permanent resident. At that time, you'll have to show that you have learned English, that you've regularly worked in the U.S., that you're 125% above the poverty level, and you'll have to pay another fine, $1,000. Then after 3 more years, you'll be able to apply for citizenship. So it's the entire path is 13 years from when this goes into effect. There are expedited paths for dreamers, so those who entered the U.S. before they were 16. They can apply for RPI status and only have to do that for 5 years, and then they can apply for citizenship immediately. And agricultural workers also have an expedited path. They'll be able to apply after either 3 years or 5 years, depending on how much they've worked in the country. The family unification section of the bill. So there are some good changes and some bad changes to this. The negative change to this is that it changes the law in that currently U.S. citizens can sponsor their siblings as well as their adult children to come to the U.S. this actually takes that provision away. So U.S. citizens will no longer be able to sponsor their siblings or their adult married children over the age of 30. That's removed. But what it does is it adds the ability for lawful permanent residents, so those are people who are here with a visa or a green card, we can call it. It allows them to sponsor their spouses and their minor children and makes it much easier for them to do that, whereas now there's a waiting period and you see families being split apart because they can't sponsor their families. It does not include, as the UUA was hoping, and many civil liberties advocates were hoping, provision for same-sex partners and non-traditional families to sponsor each other. That's not in the bill. And importantly, what it does include is that it allows families who are awaiting their status, awaiting their green card, to stay in the U.S. And allows them to travel back and forth. Another section of the bill has to do with work visas, and this is something that a lot of people have advocated for, including the UUA, and it's really important because currently in immigration law, it's very difficult if you're an unskilled worker to come to the U.S. legally and get a work visa. Work visas are typically for high-skilled workers. So the bill creates a W visa, which would allow for low-skilled workers to have a work visa and come to the U.S. and work. It also would allow them to bring their family with them, which is really important in keeping families together, and allows them to travel back and forth to visit their family in their home country. The negative side of this is that it's a little bit low. The first year, they're initially going to allow 20,000 of these W visas. That will rise to 75,000 in 4 years, which is not very many visas. But it also uses a formula that the government will look at each year to kind of balance what the need is, and it will allow it to increase if the need is more. The issue of interior enforcement, which is what it's referred to in the bill, which really has a lot to do with due process and what's happening to immigrants once they're in the country and how the laws treat them. Currently, when an immigrant gets, let's say, arrested and put in a detention center, they'll sit there and they'll really languish for years and years. They don't have a right to an attorney. They don't have a right to periodic review of their case. It's really problematic. So the law actually makes some really positive improvements to this. It allows it so that immigrants will have periodic reviews of their cases by a judge. It increases the accountability of detention centers by requiring inspections and evaluations, which is important because we've seen and heard a lot about the way that people are treated in these detention centers, and it's not so great. And importantly, it actually it requires that those findings become public. It reduces the backlog of current immigration cases by expanding the courts, by hiring more judges and staff, and increasing training for them, which is very important. And I think this is really great. It actually requires that legal information be provided to an immigrant in a detention center so they can know what their rights are, which they don't know at all right now. And although it doesn't require appointment of an attorney for all immigrants in detention centers, it actually does require judges to appoint counsel in special cases, which include children unaccompanied by parents and people with various mental health issues. So that's a step in the right direction, definitely. It also, one more positive I should mention, it streamlines the asylum process, which right now it can be very difficult to apply for asylum, so it'll be easier under the new bill. The negative aspect of it is that there's a mandatory e-verification system, which will have to be put into place within 5 years. That's something that the UUA opposes. A lot of civil liberties groups oppose that. It applies to all of us. We'll all be in this government verification database. And it can be problematic because if there are mistakes, or let's say you change your name or you have a misspelling in your name, it can be hard to challenge that and you may not be able to find work. So that's problematic, and we should advocate against that. So just to wrap up, that's the bill in a nutshell. Again, it's 800 pages, so I'm not an expert, but it gives you an idea of some of the positives and the negatives. We have a lot more information about it at the back of the table if you want. So what can we do now? What's the next step as a congregation? As Meg's sermon mentioned today, we have a voice and we have the ability to be strong allies, and it's very important that we do that, because when you look at any time a group is marginalized, or any time a group's rights are taken away, that really affects all of us, and we should all care about that as Americans, as people in this country. We should care that everyone's rights are protected. And so it's important for us, I think, to be an ally and to stand up and say what's important and what should happen in in this new immigration bill. So we're actually, as Peggy mentioned, we have a lot of stuff going on, so if you want to get involved, you can talk to us after. But one very important thing you can do today is we have a postcard on the table that you can take and you can fill out, and you can write a little bit more about what you want to see in immigration reform. And we're going to be meeting with Senator Cornyn in about a week to deliver these postcards. He's on the Judiciary Committee in the Senate, which is currently looking at the bill, and he's the ranking member of the Immigration Subcommittee of that, so he has a good amount of power in terms of what goes in the final bill. And so it's great timing to get our voices to him. And with that, I'm going to stop talking now and turn it over to Karen, who's going to talk a little more about some of the political landscape as well. Thank you.
Thanks. And I'd like to tell you a little bit about what's been going on in the Texas legislature, and then give you kind of a feeling for some of the different strange bedfellows that get involved in some of these issues. I have been a lobbyist since 1988 for community banks. That's the independent banks that are there to serve their communities, and it's a very dear to my heart kind of a group that I represent. So over the last several sessions, we've seen a lot of legislation introduced that would impact immigrants. There's a strong feeling among certain people that there is a huge cost in the emergency rooms of our hospitals, particularly in the big cities, with regard to immigrants who aren't treated, don't have insurance, and so they wind up going to the emergency rooms, and that's very expensive. So what's the logical answer? Why? Let's tax foreign remittances, because we all know that this is a huge deal, that they're all working here so that they can send money back home, and that is partially true. And that is a significant source of revenue in some countries like Mexico. It has been in the past. So bills were introduced to do just that, tax foreign remittances. Now, that could be those funds that you purchase at the convenience store and you send money back home through money orders or what have you. But they didn't think it all the way through. So I was strongly opposed to this because of the implication for wire transfers. And who was the other major opponent? The oil and gas industry. Texaco would have been taxed out the wazoo for their foreign wires that go all over the world. So it would have had a very odd impact on a very different constituency than they were thinking about. Second issue that's very, very important, and that came up first in 2009, and that's voter ID. So in 2009, we had a very strong bill that many of us viewed as being related to voter suppression, but was touted as being there to prevent fraud. Now, the attorneys general could not find the fraud. He did find 6 cases that had nothing to do with non-citizens voting, but we needed to wipe out fraud. So we are going to have voter ID, right? And I want to share with you a very important story. What happened in 2009? Mario Gallegos from Houston, senator from Houston, came by ambulance on his hospital bed so that he could cast the vote needed to block that bill in the Senate from a hearing. And Republican Senator Dr. Bob Jewell was right there by his bedside so that he could make sure that Mario Gallego was taken care of while he took that vote. And that vote blocked it in 2009. Now, in 2011, our governor, Rick Perry, was getting ready for perhaps greater things. So he set up a couple of priorities in the Texas legislative session. One of them was voter ID, and the other one was sanctuary cities. Now, sanctuary cities did not actually make it through the legislature. Oh, wait, because we don't have any. But we wanted to block them in case they ever should, get created. But voter ID did pass this time because there were not enough Democratic votes in the Senate to block it. So it became the law in Texas in 2011. Now let's fast forward to 2013. We do not have those emergency bills because our governor is not at this point getting ready for a presidential race. So we don't have those things going on. We do have, however, one bill that I think may actually continue moving, and that has to do with driver's licenses. Now, these driver's licenses would be available to people who are undocumented. And it may actually pass. There are a lot of law enforcement people that would like to see it pass for many reasons. One, it helps to bring people out of the shadows. Hopefully it would encourage them to actually report crimes that occur to them. And it would be a good thing as far as, for example, Art Acevedo is concerned. The problem with the bill, from my perspective, is that the driver's license that would be created would be unique. I don't know if any of you have kids under the age of 21. You look at the driver's license, you know immediately they're under 21 because the photo is turned a different way, right? These would be unique driver's licenses, so you could immediately glance at them and see, this is an undocumented person. My personal guess is that a lot of folks that are that do not have their papers would not wish to have something carried around that says, hey, I don't have my documents. So that could be one problem. And the other is you could not use it as ID for getting on an airplane, for example. So it's not going to be hugely valuable. And we still have a lot of people that are opposed to it. So that's one of the bills relating to immigration issues that is pending in the Texas legislature. And my hunch is that it probably will not pass, but if it does, it may not have a huge impact because of the various issues relating to how it would actually be implemented. Now, let's fast forward into some of the political issues that we have to think about with regard to the federal bill. I just got back from D.C. on Friday. I wasn't lobbying on immigration, but on banking issues at that time. But here's what we're hearing in D.C. First of all, the incident in Boston is going to be used to say, you see what happens when we give asylum? We have this kind of event occur. Now, they really have nothing to do with each other, but that's going to be used, I think, to slow down the whole pace of reform. Now, alternatively, it can be used to say, this is why we need reform, because we didn't have a good system in place, and we don't have good systems in place to monitor movements across the border. So it can go either way, but it's definitely going to be used. Now, here's the next thing to remember. A lot of folks have said, well, you know, the Republicans have lost 5 of the last 6 popular votes for president. Think about that for a moment. And they've lost them in the Hispanic community, let me say. And so that is very, very significant. So you have the Republican Party grappling with the fact that they do not appeal to a rising voting number. So they're thinking, well, we need to reverse our stand on immigration. Now, other Republicans would say, wait a minute, we're going to set up a whole new class of people, oh wait, in 13 years, that might be voting against us. So that can cut either way. Here's the real issue as we see it. We have 2 houses. The senators get elected by the entire state, right? So they have to appeal to the entire population. That's not what happens in the House of Representatives. Each one of those districts is carefully designed. In school, you learned the term gerrymandered to be safe. So when a person is running for a congressional seat, a House seat, they are running from a district that is designed to be either very purely Republican or very purely Democratic, but we see very few purple districts. And that means if I want to get elected, I must appeal to the part of my party that will show up for a primary vote, and that's going to be the extremes. So that's going to be a problem with regard to the House. Just a little bit of the political side. Now I'm going to turn it over to Vick to talk about some of the other issues.
You may remember from the introduction she gave that I am actually the head of the Religious Freedom Campaign for the ACLU of Texas, not the Immigrants' Rights Campaign. So I'm winging it. But what I wanted to talk about was the way we tie the local and the state and the federal all together, the way we do it as an organization. So the comprehensive immigration reform obviously is federal, and that's being handled by our national ACLU office. Obviously, we've got lobbyists as well. They're trying to get various amendments in, trying to make it a better bill. A shorter bill would be nice. And then here at the state level, obviously, when the Pink Dome is full and ledge session is going on, then we try and deal with some of those local state issues. But primarily what we deal with is the Constitution-free zone, the 100 miles in from the border where all of the basically the trampling of civil rights goes on. You've got the racial profiling, you've got searches and seizures, you've got drones and cameras, militarization of the Border Patrol, the IRC, or immigration reform, would actually make it so that the National Guard can work within that 100-mile zone much more easily, which is problematic because we don't want the military there. And really, the border isn't a 100-mile zone. The ACLU has asked that to be reduced to 25 miles. But so here's how it all works together. So I don't know if any of y'all are familiar with the La Jolla shooting. There was a truck fleeing DPS. A DPS helicopter pursued the truck and shot at the truck, killing 2 people in the truck and severely injuring another one. At the time, there was one police force in the United States that could shoot at a moving vehicle from a flying helicopter, and that was the Texas Department of Public Safety. And other states found out that we could do that, and they went, what? So what we did, so here's how it all ties together. At the local level, we've got an office down in Brownsville with a staff of 1, and she's great. So she got in touch with various church organizations, various community organizations, Bob Leibel, La Raza, a whole bunch of different organizations. And then we had a press conference down there. A bunch of staff from the Houston and Austin office went down there. We got a whole bunch of people, and this is where the fun is. We got people riled up, making a lot of noise down on the border. Please stop shooting at us from helicopter. And then because of all of that hubbub, we got the state level to change their policy. DPS said, okay, we won't do that anymore unless we're being shot at. So, yay. And now our national office can take that incident, that community response, as well as the initial incident, and go to the legislators in DC and say, look, if you don't fix these problems with the militarization of the Border Patrol, with the Constitution-free zone and the abuse of power, then anything that you call comprehensive immigration reform isn't really. So that's what we were going with. Local troublemakers to make it all part of the conversation at the state level, and then we use that at the federal level. And with that, I believe we're going to questions and answers.
Yes, and thank you for updating us on these important issues.
Yes, I'm Philip Russell, and I have a question about the proposed immigration reform. 90% security sounds terribly precise, but 90% of what, and how do you measure it?
That's a good question, and I don't know that I can really answer that because I'm not completely familiar with how they're going to enforce that, but it is very high, and I think what that means is that people they're I guess catching 90% of the people that are sneaking across the border, right? But it's going to take some time to get to that point. I mean, because first what happens is the bill authorizes the Department of Homeland Security to to write these regulations and then enact these regulations and then get to a 90% effectiveness rate. So it's going to take a long time before we get to the point where they're at that, and then we can get the path to citizenship. So I think that's something that we can advocate maybe shouldn't be included, shouldn't be required, should not be dependent. Citizenship should not be dependent upon that.
say your name?
Yes, I'm Fred Higgins, and I have a question for Samantha. Somewhere when you were talking, you were describing the application for RPI status, and you said at the beginning they had to be 100% above poverty level, and then eventually 125% above. For example, let's say poverty level is 25,000. Does that mean they have to make 50,000 to apply for that status, to be 100% above?
Yeah, I'm not totally sure how that works, but I think it would be 100%, which would be that. Yeah.
I'm Kent Stewart. I'm a little bit concerned. Would you explain to me how you would verify whether or not you had a legal immigrant or a legal work person if you do not use electronic evaluation? What other system would you use to validate a legal worker?
Well, as you probably recall, with the immigration reform under George H.W. Bush, one of the things that was changed was the I-9 requirement. Anytime any employer of any size, if you have only one employee, you have to comply with that. And the I-9 requirements have recently been upgraded. So when you have an employee, you have to do two things. You have to check for immigration status and ability to work. So you have to look at two kinds of ID right now, and you have to fill out a Form I-9 and retain records showing that you have complied with that. The problem, of course, is that some kinds of identification are forged. So Social Security cards might be forged. The problem with E-Verify is that so far, and let me say so far, it is extremely inaccurate. So a lot of people are getting kicked out who really are legitimate citizens. And one of the critical things, just like we need to have the border more secure, we need to have E-Verify actually work. And so if E-Verify is going to be used, it needs to be accurate.
We have a question here. Would you stand and say your name?
My name is Felicia Conn-Gable, and I wanted to thank all four of you for all the work you're doing and have done. And my question is two-part. If you came across the border before 2011, you can apply. But if you've come since, you can't, which means what? And if you did come before 2011, and you have to wait until the fence and everything else is all perfect, then are you still as at much risk as you were anyway?
Well, I'm not 100% sure, but I think there's something in the bill that addresses that issue of people who came over after 2011. And I think there is some sort of provision that, although I think they have to go back to their country, I think it is a little bit easier. Do you know the answer to that, Vick? Yeah. And the second part of your question, can you repeat that? Yeah, and that I would think probably yes, until, because first the bill has to get passed, and then it has to, the regulations have to go into effect. So I would think until that point, then current law would apply, and so it would be.
Except that there is an executive order that was signed by the president to deal with that to some extent, so that really somebody that is arrested or has a history of a felony would be subject to the deportation and holding, etc., whereas they're not going to be imposing it just as loosely as they have. Seriously, the young woman who jaywalked then was at risk of being deported. And that kind of result is hopefully eliminated by the executive order. And that's the relief that's there right now. There's some question among certain people as to whether the executive order is valid, but it's there, and it's going to guide the agencies. Vick, do you have some thoughts about that?
Okay. We have a question here. Jack, stand up.
I'd like to mention a couple of things that is almost never discussed in this debate. First of these is that I have a lot of personal experience with scientists coming from overseas and working at our laboratory, and I've had probably 10 or 15 or more from China staying at my house for upwards of several months. I talked to all of them about how they got here and this kind of thing, and almost always they have degrees from a Chinese university. They're excellent students. They have very good records. They have several, after graduation, they've been to an institute or maybe another university, got several publications, some of them even in English. Then they come here and apply to our graduate schools. Our students don't have any chance whatever of competing with them. We are not allowed to get any kind of publications in most situations until we already have a doctor's degree or at least a master's. So they're filling up the universities, so our students can't even get in. And then they can't get jobs when they get out either because they already have the jobs lined up. There are thousands of students coming from overseas like that, especially from China and India. The other problem is, what?
Can you get to a question?
No, I didn't have a question about that. This is a comment. I think some restrictions should be put on that, and a lot of these students are overstaying their visas too. They should be sent back home for the reason they came over here. The other question is that one of our church members, a lady professor from University of Texas, soon after the free trade agreement with Mexico, went down there and looked around to see what was the effect on the Mexican people. And it was devastating. She visited several small businesses, and they could not compete with the cheap goods that came in from the U.S. The subsistence farmers could not sell their products because the agricultural products from the U.S. were cheaper. Thousands and thousands of people were out of jobs and came up to the U.S., not because they want to come to the U.S., but because they're desperate. They had to have the job someplace so they could come here. That's it.
Okay. Thank you. Let me add a question here. Is an emphasis on economic development within Mexico, for example, and other Latin American countries, part of a coordinated immigration reform program?
Not that I recall. And don't forget that we have several different kinds of immigrants that are involved in all of this, the current law and then the proposed law. So right now we already have, and I always get the name wrong, it's H-1B visas, so that certain high-tech industries can bring in very highly educated folks under that particular kind of visa. So we already have some variances that we're putting into place in current law. But we have a bracero program. That's not what they call it, but that's what it is. We had a bracero program before, but part of this bill is agricultural immigrants. And there are some concerns about how that's going to affect American workers.
Thank you, Karen. We have a question here. Fred?
Yes. Related to that, I'm curious about where, for lack of a better word, guest worker program fits into all this. For example, like allowing someone to come over here for 6 months, documented for 6 months, paying taxes, completely legal, and then being able to go back to their home country.
Yeah, I think the work visa is kind of like that because it allows, I don't have it written down. It does specify, I think, how many days per year you have to work, and then it allows you to travel back and forth. So it would allow you to come here and bring your family if you wanted to, or if you just wanted to come here and work and then go back home with your family, you could do that. So it gives the person the option to travel back and forth, which I think is huge because now, families are being split apart when people are coming here and working in the shadows and they're not able to travel back and forth. So I think that's a good addition to the bill.
Okay. I think it's important to realize that this issue is highly emotion charged. which is one of the difficulties of working out a comprehensive plan that can be passed. Douglas, do you have a question?
Thank you. My question gets back to a comment I believe Samantha made, which was there's nothing in the new law about same-sex families. And in recent months, additional countries have passed same-sex marriage bills. I believe most recently France and Uruguay. So now a number of South American countries do allow same-sex marriage. So my question to the panel is, what are the odds of getting some sort of inclusion of same-sex relationships in a comprehensive immigration bill in the future?
I can answer that as an idealist, and maybe Karen can answer it as a realist. I don't know. But I think that, I would think and I would hope that maybe, depending on what happens with the Supreme Court, they have heard a case on DOMA, the Defense of Marriage Act, and if they rule DOMA to be unconstitutional, then the federal government will essentially recognize same-sex marriages. And if the federal government recognizes same-sex marriages, then maybe that means that the immigration bill would not make a distinction, or maybe there shouldn't be a distinction. I don't know. But I think that it's certainly, if the Supreme Court does hold DOMA unconstitutional, advocates can make that argument, and we can say, like, look, if this is what the federal law is now, that we recognize same-sex marriages, then shouldn't the immigration bill do that as well, seeing as how it's federal law? So that's my sort of idealist hope. I think we have to advocate for it, and I think it's challenging. That was one of the things that I was doing before when I was in New York working for the ACLU. We were trying to bring together different groups on immigration. So we did a lot of work with LGBT activists and immigrants' rights activists, trying to bring people together and say, look, we're all in this together. We need to have laws that protect all of our rights. And so, I'm hopeful, but I don't know. Now, Karen will.
Not very. Remember that VAWA did not get reenacted for a while. In fact, it was looking like it was not going to get reenacted. VAWA is Violence Against Women Act. And the problem that came up with regard to it was the addition of violence against same-sex families. And that held it up and kept it from getting enacted until there was just a really tremendous backlash. And so I think the same kind of issue would come up again. So it would be an uphill slog. Hopefully that experience, the VAWA experience, and then what happens on DOMA will be, I think, the turning points there. So I agree with you, Samantha.
Have a question from Judy, who put this panel together, and we're very grateful for that. Judy?
Actually, it's a comment. In the back, we have a lot of literature, and there are talking points to call your senator on this very issue of same-sex.
All right. I think at this point, if there are no more questions, we do have more questions. Okay.
My name is Margaret Wood, and I would like to know how we're going to keep track of all these people. We can't keep track of them now. Or do we want to?
That actually is a very valid issue. One of the problems that has been raised by a number of folks is the fact that as long as you're moving in and out of the country by air, there's very good tracking on entries and exits. But if you're leaving by sea or by ground, then there isn't that clear of a tracking. I suspect that what we'll see are things like there's a particular visa that was created collaboratively between the U.S. and Mexico that you swipe. And I would suspect that we'll come up with some kind of process where you actually swipe in or use a chip or technology in order to know when you came in, and then monitor the length of your visa. If it's 6 months, then there would be a flag that says this person hadn't swiped to leave, so they must have overstayed their visa. And candidly, I think that's what it will get toward, using the technology that we have in credit cards, whether it's magstripe or it's near field or it's chip, to embed that into permanent kinds of cards to then monitor the ins and outs. And that already exists in plastic in a particular kind of a visa issued by the Mexican government.
There was a question over here. Somebody raised their hand just a couple of moments ago. Okay. At this point, I'd like to have each of you maybe take just 45 seconds, less than a minute, and tell us something that you think is essential for us to know, our audience here and our TV audience, and how we can support this effort. Peggy?
Well, I would just like everyone to know about what we have going on here. And you can find out at our website, www.austinuu.org. Read our online newsletter, read our online announcements. Visit us at the social action table after any church service in the gallery.
Yeah, I want to reiterate what I said earlier about us being allies. I think that's very important. Everyone in this country has a voice. The way that the world works, some people have louder voices than others. And so those of us who do maybe come from a more privileged background and have the ability to get our voices out there more than, say, an undocumented immigrant living in the shadows, really should. And this provides us with a great opportunity to do that. So as Peggy said, get involved. There's tons of information out there, and fill out a postcard on your way out.
If you have the opportunity, try to meet your representative so that then when you do communicate with them, they'll know who you are. And then send your information to them. Let me just emphasize this, electronically. Use email, use technology. The latest Rice and Scare points out that they don't get mail. They do not get mail. It all goes through a particular center. So send your messages to them electronically. That's all available to you online, and I'd be happy to share the information later.
And just to build off of what they were saying, everyone should get involved. You can just, in the spirit of Meg's sermon today, cause a ruckus. It's both fun and productive. So yeah, and know your legislator. They should see you coming and go, oh, there he is again. Because that's fun too.
Yes, and the squeaky wheel does get heard.
And just really quick, I forgot to mention that we are going to visit Senator Cornell on May 6th, which is a Monday at 3 p.m., to deliver these postcards. So if anybody wants to come with us, talk to me or Peggy afterwards. We definitely would love to have you. So thanks.
Thank you again, and thank you, Judy Zadag, for organizing this for us.